The silver tray in my hands felt like a lead weight, and I had exactly 10 steps to tell a king he was about to become a corpse. My thumb pressed against the corner of the crumpled ledger page in my pocket, the paper damp with the sweat of my palm. It was a live wire, threatening to burn through my starched apron before I could reach him, a piece of evidence so volatile it could dismantle a dynasty or get me buried in the concrete foundations of a city. For 3 years, I had been the ghost of the Kong penthouse, a shadow in a black and white uniform who moved through the rooms with the silent precision of a clockwork doll. I polished the mahogany, I ironed the heavy silk sheets, and I learned to breathe in the rarefied air of absolute power without ever making a sound. But tonight, the air was different. It wasn't just thin. It was electric, heavy with a metallic tang of ozone and the unmistakable scent of a looming storm. Around me, the penthouse hummed with a silent, suffocating frequency of wealth, the delicate chime of silver against boned china, the rich, buttery aroma of roasted wagyu, and the rhythmic tick of the grandfather clock in the foyer that sounded like a slow-motion detonator. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass, the Chicago skyline glittered like a spilled box of diamonds, a kingdom laid out at the feet of the man I served. But in here, the atmosphere was too still, the silence too practiced. I approached the head of the long dining table as if I were walking toward my own firing squad, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs that no amount of professional training could suppress. Kong Jae-hyun sat perfectly upright, his silhouette framed by the sprawling lights of the city behind him. He looked like he had been forged in a furnace and tempered in ice, a sharp, unrelenting jawline, eyes the color of cold flint, and a charcoal suit that cost more than my sister's 4-year nursing tuition. His fingers were laced together on the white linen tablecloth, his posture stiff, projecting a dangerous, suspicious calm that kept even the most seasoned associates at a distance. He was a man who lived in the center of a hurricane, yet he seemed entirely unaware that the walls of his sanctuary were beginning to crumble from the inside out. Beside him, the woman in the red dress leaned in close, her long, wavy hair brushing his shoulder as she whispered something into his ear. Her lips were curved into a serene, practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes that were as hard and calculating as the diamonds at her throat. Those stones caught the golden light of the massive crystal chandelier above, throwing jagged sparks across the table, reflecting off the polished silver and the deep red of the wine. To anyone else, she looked like his most loyal confidant, his partner in both shadow and light. But I had seen the ledger. I had seen the numbers that didn't add up, the siphoned millions moving like ghost ships through offshore accounts, and I knew that her beauty was merely the velvet sheath for a very sharp blade. 15 minutes ago, I had been in the darkened study, polishing the heavy mahogany desk when the shadows in the hallway moved. I had shrunk into the alcove, becoming the invisible girl once more, as Jae-hyun's brother, Min-jun, walked past. He wasn't alone. He was checking the magazines of tactical rifles with a group of men I didn't recognize, his voice a low, jagged rasp as he bragged about how the security outside wouldn't be looking for threats tonight because they were the ones being paid to create them. They hadn't even glanced my way. I was just the maid, a fixture of the house no more significant than the floor lamps or the heavy velvet drapes. That was their first mistake. They assumed that because I was silent, I was also deaf and blind. As I took the final few steps toward the table, my eyes flickered instinctively toward the heavy velvet curtains that framed the balcony doors. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a stray reflection from the crystal decanter or the city's neon glow. But then I saw it, a tiny, blood red, dancing rhythmically across the dark fabric. It moved with a predatory grace, searching for the precise point where the velvet met the air, searching for the heartbeat beneath Jae-hyun's charcoal jacket. It was a sniper's kiss, a laser sight marking the end of an era. The discrepancy in the ledgers I discovered earlier wasn't just a sign of greed. It was the down payment for this very execution. Every cent stolen by Min-jun had been a brick in the wall closing in around the man sitting before me. The tray in my hands began to tremble, the crystal glassware singing a delicate, mournful note as the vibrations of my fear traveled through the silver. I forced my muscles to lock, my breathing to shallow. The woman in the red dress glanced up at me, her gaze cold and dismissing, waiting for me to refill her glass and vanish back into the shadows where I belonged. She didn't see a human being. She saw a tool, a convenience that was about to become collateral damage. She had no idea that I was the only thing standing between her and the total success of her betrayal. I reached the table, the scent of her expensive, cloying perfume clashing with the cold ozone of the air conditioning. I didn't pour the wine. Instead, I leaned down, moving closer to Jae-hyun than any servant ever dared. The proximity was staggering. I could feel the radiation of his icy presence, the sheer gravity of his power. I watched the red laser shift from the curtain to the back of his leather chair, a silent countdown beginning in the dark of the balcony. My voice was a ghost of a sound, a crimson whisper intended for his ears alone. "Don't move, Mr. Kong." I breathed, the words barely vibrating the air. "Your brother took the money. The guards are gone. They're waiting outside the glass." For a heartbeat, he didn't react. The world seemed to stop spinning. Then, I felt his entire frame turn to stone beneath the charcoal wool. His gaze didn't shift, but his fingers unlaced with agonizing slowness, his hands hovering inches from the edge of the mahogany table. He didn't look at the curtains, and he didn't look at the woman in red, but I saw the shift in his eyes, the flint turning to steel. The trap was set, the sniper was ready, and the girl who polished the silver had just flipped the board. I was no longer a witness. I was a participant in a war that was about to shatter the glass and change the city forever. I could feel the woman in red's eyes on me now, suspicious of the prolonged proximity, her smile faltering just a fraction. She sensed a change in the air, a ripple in the smooth surface of her plan. I stood my ground, my thumb still pressing that crumpled paper in my pocket, waiting for the first shot to ring out and end the world we knew. The ticking of the clock seemed to grow louder, filling the room, counting down the final seconds of his reign, or the first seconds of our survival. I had delivered the warning. Now, all that was left was to see if the king could fight his way out of the grave his own blood had dug for him. The red was steady now, centered perfectly on his spine, and I realized with a jolt of terror that I was standing directly in the line of fire. Yet I didn't move. In the silence of the penthouse, the invisible witness had finally spoken, and the echo was going to be deafening. The weight of the tray was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. I looked at Jae-hyun, and for the first time in 3 years, he looked back, his reflection in the dark window showing a man who finally saw the shadow at his side. The glass was silent, the city was bright, and the hammer was about to fall. I braced myself for the impact, knowing that when the glass shattered, the shards would spare no one, least of all the girl who knew too much. The invisible life I had led was over. From this moment on, every breath would be a battle, and every shadow a potential grave. The ledger's truth was out, the laser was fixed, and the dance of death had begun. I felt a strange sense of peace as the first mechanical click of a rifle safety being disengaged drifted in from the balcony, a sound only a ghost would notice. The game had truly begun. The silence that followed my whispered warning was a brittle, crystalline thing, a thin skin of normalcy stretched over a pit of impending violence. I did not pull away immediately. To do so would have been to signal that something fundamental had shifted. Instead, I remained inclined toward Jae-hyun, the proximity between a maid and a mafia king, a boundary shattered by the gravity of survival. I could smell the expensive, cold cedarwood of his cologne and the faint, metallic scent of the heavy handgun he undoubtedly had holstered beneath that charcoal jacket. My heart was a frantic, stuttering bird against my ribs, but my hands, miraculously, did not shake as I lowered the tray. I was a ghost who had finally spoken, and the weight of that speech felt like lead in my veins. I had delivered the verdict. Now, I had to wait for the executioner to respond. Across the table, the woman in the red dress, Selena, did not flinch. Her smile remained perfectly intact, a masterpiece of socialite deception that had likely been polished in the same high-end boutiques where she bought her gowns. To her, I was still merely a background texture, an animated fixture of the penthouse whose only purpose was to facilitate her comfort. She thought I was merely inquiring about the temperature of the wine or perhaps apologizing for a perceived slight in the service. She was so deep in her own play, so confident in the betrayal she had orchestrated with Minjun, that she couldn't see the world ending in the reflection of my eyes. She reached for her crystal flute with a movement so fluid it was predatory, her diamonds sparking with a celebratory fire that was entirely premature. She was waiting for the glass to shatter. She was waiting for the man beside me to slump over the wagyu, so she could finally claim the throne she had been siphoning for months. "Is there a problem with the service, Jae-hyun?" she asked, her voice like silk drawn over a razor blade. She directed the question to him, but her eyes, sharp, emerald and terrifyingly cold, flickered to me for a fraction of a second. It was the look a human gives to an annoying insect, a brief acknowledgement of a nuisance before it is swatted. She didn't realize that the insect had just dismantled the web she had spent a year spinning. She didn't realize that the spare brother she was backing had already lost the element of surprise. She just smiled, that serene, empty smile, and waited for her lover to dismiss the help so they could continue their final meal in peace. Jae-hyun didn't look at her. He didn't even look at me. His gaze remained fixed on the city skyline, staring out at the kingdom that was currently being sold out from under him. But beneath the table, the shift was absolute. I saw the subtle, terrifying shift in his jaw, the way the muscle bunched and locked with the force of a man holding back a hurricane. Slowly, with a casual grace that masked a lethal intent, his right hand moved. He didn't reach for a weapon yet. Instead, his fingers brushed against the small, crumpled piece of ledger paper I had placed on the edge of the mahogany table, hidden by the deep shadow of his sleeve. He felt the dampness of my sweat on the paper, felt the jagged edge where I had torn it from the books, and in that touch, the invisible bond was forged. He knew. I felt the shift in the room's gravity, a heavy, oppressive weight that made the air feel too thick to breathe. The security on the balcony hadn't moved, but the red laser on the velvet curtain had gone still, centered now with mathematical precision on the back of Jae-hyun's chair. The hunters were taking their final, synchronized breath before the squeeze of the trigger. Every tick of the grandfather clock in the foyer was a hammer blow against my skull. I was standing directly in the crosshairs, a maid in a black and white uniform acting as a human shield for a man who had never looked at me twice until this very second. The irony was a bitter taste on my tongue, sharper than the wine. "No problem at all," Jae-hyun finally said. His voice was a low, vibrating rumble that seemed to rise from the floorboards, a sound of tectonic plates grinding together. It was a voice that commanded empires and signed death warrants, and right now, it was thick with a newfound, icy clarity. "In fact, Elena, the service tonight has been enlightening. I'm seeing things I've overlooked for a very long time." He finally turned his head toward me. For the first time in the 3 long years I had worked in this penthouse, cleaning his messes and disappearing into the wallpaper, Kang Jae-hyun actually saw me. He didn't see a maid, he saw a witness. He saw the only living soul in this gilded cage who wasn't actively trying to kill him. Those flint-gray eyes searched mine, looking for the tremor of a lie, looking for the telltale sign of a double cross, and found only the cold, hard terror of a woman who had nothing left to lose but her life. In that silent exchange, the hierarchy of the house evaporated. I wasn't the help anymore. I was the lifeline. Elena laughed, a light, melodic sound that felt like ice water down my spine. "You're always so dramatic, darling. It's just dinner. Though I must admit, the help is getting a bit familiar. Don't you think?" She cast another glance at me, her brow arching in a silent command for me to retreat. "Pour the wine, girl. We have a toast to make to the future. To a new era of the Kong family." I reached for the bottle of vintage Cabernet, my fingers steadying as a strange, hollow calm settled over me. It was the calm of the condemned, the stillness that comes when you realize the exit is blocked and the only way out is through the fire. The game had changed, and she was the only one at the table who didn't know the rules had been rewritten in blood. I poured the dark, crimson liquid into her glass, watching the bubbles rise to the surface like drowning gasps. The wine looked like blood in the candlelight, a fitting libation for the betrayal she had cultivated. As I stepped back, merging once more into the heavy shadows cast by the velvet drapes, Jae-hyun's hand disappeared beneath the table. I knew where it was going. He was reaching for the cold steel of the handgun he kept in a hidden holster, his fingers finding the familiar grip. The grandfather clock struck the hour, the deep, resonant tolling echoing through the silent penthouse. It was a funeral bell for the woman in red, though she didn't know it yet. She raised her glass, the diamonds on her fingers flashing one last time in the golden light of the chandelier. "To loyalty," she whispered, her eyes meeting Jae-hyun's with a faked tenderness that made me want to scream. "And to those who know how to keep it." Jae-hyun didn't raise his glass. He didn't smile. He simply watched her, his face a mask of granite, while on the curtain behind him, the red of the sniper's laser began to tremble as the shooter adjusted their aim for the final killing blow. I leaned against the cold wall, my hand clutching the edge of the tray so hard the silver bit into my skin. I had delivered the note. I had whispered the truth into the ear of the king. Now, the world was going to shatter, and I would be right there in the center of the debris, a ghost no longer, but a participant in the carnage to come. The woman in red took a sip of her wine, her throat moving as she swallowed the lie, and I knew that when the next second ticked, the invisible life I had led would be burned away by the flash of a muzzle. The crimson whisper was over. The roar of the war was about to begin. She looked so satisfied, sitting there in her silk and stones, believing she had outplayed the man who built the city. She didn't see the way Jae-hyun's body was coiled like a spring, ready to snap. She didn't see the way I was watching the balcony doors, waiting for the glass to disintegrate into a million stinging needles. She was a queen of a kingdom that had already fallen, ruling over a dinner that would never be finished. I closed my eyes for a heartbeat, praying to a god I hadn't spoken to in years, and when I opened them, the red was steady. The trigger was being pulled. The game hadn't just changed, it was over. And as the first crack of the sniper's rifle finally broke the silence, I realized that the only thing more dangerous than a mafia boss was the maid who knew his secrets and the woman who thought she could steal them. The air was cold, the wine was red, and the shadows were finally reaching out to claim what was theirs. The end had arrived, and it was beautiful and terrible all at once. I stood in the darkness, the Treya shield I hoped would be enough, and watched as the first shard of glass began its long, slow-motion descent toward the floor, reflecting the red of the dress, the red of the laser, and the red of the blood that was about to follow. The transition was complete. I was no longer a witness. I was the one who had pulled the pin on the grenade, and all that was left was to survive the explosion. The clock ticked one last time, and then the world simply stopped being quiet. It was time for the king to fight, and for the maid to show just how much she had learned while she was invisible. The Crimson Whisper had set the stage, and now, the curtains were finally coming down in a rain of fire and lead. The chime of the clock had not yet dissolved into the stillness of the room before the world fractured into 1,000 jagged pieces. It began not with a roar, but with a sharp, whip-crack snap that pulverized the air itself, the sound of a high-velocity round piercing the heavy, pressurized glass of the balcony door. The vintage crystal flute in Elena's hand didn't just break, it vanished in a spray of fine, glittering dust and dark red wine. The liquid exploded across her face, a grotesque mockery of the celebratory toast she had just offered, her shriek of surprise cut short by the sheer, unadulterated violence of the physics now rewriting the evening. The wine sprayed across the white linen tablecloth like a fresh bloodstain, an omen realized in a fraction of a second, but I didn't have time to watch her fall. In the same heartbeat, Jae-hyun moved. He was no longer the man who sat rigidly at the head of a dinner table. He was a predator in mid-strike, a coiled spring of lethal intent finally released from its tension. With a guttural roar that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards and into the marrow of my bones, he lunged forward. His massive frame collided with the underside of the heavy mahogany table with the force of a battering ram. The wood groaned, a deep, wooden protest as the hundreds of pounds of polished timber were upended. I watched in a blur of motion as the $1,000 feast slid toward the floor, the porcelain bone china shattering, the silver clattering, and the heavy crystal decanters bursting into shards, all lost in the deafening, seismic crash as he flipped the entire slab on its side to create a fortress of grain and varnish. "Get down," he bellowed, the command cutting through the sudden, high-pitched ringing in my ears. But I was already frozen, my boots slick with spilled Cabernet and my eyes wide as the world tilted on its axis. I was a deer in the glare of a coming storm, my brain unable to process the speed at which luxury had turned into a slaughterhouse. The second shot punched a hole through the velvet curtains, the fabric billowing like a wounded sail as the bullet buried itself in the plaster wall exactly where Jae-hyun's head had been a second before. The impact sent a cloud of white dust into the air, mingling with the smell of gunpowder and expensive perfume. He didn't wait for the third shot to find its mark. His hand clamped around my forearm like a vice made of hot iron. The heat of his skin seared through the thin, starched cotton of my maid sleeve, a grip so powerful it threatened to bruise the bone. He didn't just pull me. He hauled me across the floor with terrifying strength, my knees skidding over the debris of the dinner, my apron catching on shards of crystal as he dragged me behind the makeshift barricade of the overturned table. He threw his body over mine, a shield of expensive charcoal wool and hard, coiled muscle. The proximity was staggering. I could feel the radiation of heat off him, hear the jagged, controlled rhythm of his breath against the crown of my head as he pushed me into the smallest possible space between the mahogany and the floor. Another crack echoed, followed by the heavy thud of a high-velocity round embedding itself into the thick wood of the table, inches from my head. The mahogany shuddered under the impact, a testament to the power of the weapon meant to end us. Across the room, Elena was scrambling toward the kitchen on her hands and knees, her serene mask stripped away to reveal a raw, panicked animalism, her elegant red gown snagging on the ruins of the dinner she had intended to be her victory lap. But the shooters weren't aiming for her. Their sights were locked on the shadow behind the table. They wanted the king, and they were willing to tear the penthouse apart to get to him. "Stay small, Amara," Jae-hyun hissed. His voice was no longer a rumble, it was a razor's edge. He was crouched over me, his presence an absolute wall against the chaos. He reached into the small of his back and pulled a matte black handgun from his hidden holster. The movement was so fluid it looked rehearsed, a dance he had performed 1,000 times in his darkest nightmares and most frequent training sessions. He checked the sight with a clinical detachment that chilled me more than the wind now howling through the hole in the glass. He was a man who had finally returned to his true element, not the boardroom or the dining hall, but the battlefield. I looked at him, my vision blurring with tears of pure, unadulterated adrenaline. "They're coming through the glass," I choked out, pointing a trembling finger toward the balcony where the red lasers were now dancing frantically across the room, searching for a gap in our defense. The city lights behind the floor-to-ceiling windows were suddenly eclipsed by dark, tactical silhouettes. 3 men in midnight gear, their faces obscured by matte balaclavas, swung over the railing from the floor above. Their boots hit the terrace with a synchronized, heavy thud that sounded like the closing of a coffin lid. They didn't bother with the doors. They didn't ask for entry. They used the butts of their rifles, swinging with mechanical, rhythmic precision. The glass didn't just break this time. It disintegrated. A wall of diamonds rained into the room, carried by the icy, biting howl of the Chicago winter wind. The temperature in the penthouse plummeted in an instant, the warm, golden scent of luxury, roasted meat, and fine wine replaced by the cold, metallic sting of gunpowder and the raw, abrasive air of the heights. The wind whipped the velvet curtains into a frenzy, making the shadows dance and flicker in the staccato light of the city below. It felt as if the very sky was pouring into the room, cold and indifferent to the blood about to be spilled on the Persian rugs. Jae-hyun didn't flinch. He leaned around the edge of the mahogany, his face a mask of lethal focus, his eyes turned into chips of frozen gray stone that reflected nothing but the coming violence. You told me the truth, he said, his voice terrifyingly calm amidst the rising roar of the wind and the crunch of boots on glass. Now stay behind me, stay low, and do not move unless I move you. If you want to see the morning, you become my shadow. He fired back then, the muzzle flash illuminating the sharp, dark lines of his face and staccato bursts of orange light that seared my retinas. Each shot was deliberate, a calculated response to the tactical team now breaching the perimeter of his sanctuary. In that moment, the invisible maid had ceased to exist. I was no longer the girl who polished the silver or ironed the shirts. I was the only person the king trusted in a room full of ghosts, traitors, and lead. As the hot brass shells hit the floor beside my head with a rhythmic, metallic tinkle, I realized there was no going back to the life of a girl who merely watched from the sidelines. I was the one who had pulled the curtain back, and now I was the one standing in the center of the stage. The mahogany table, once a symbol of his status, was now our only sanctuary, a wooden shield against a world that wanted us dead. The wind screamed through the broken penthouse, carrying away the last vestiges of the life I knew, leaving only the cold reality of the war I had started. I watched a shard of glass, larger than the rest, slide slowly across the floor toward us, reflecting the muzzle flashes like a strobe light. Jae-hyun's shoulder pressed against mine, a solid, unyielding weight that was the only thing keeping me grounded in the madness. He was a man of 1,000 secrets, but in the heat of the gunfire, he was simple. He was a shield. And I, the girl who had seen the dots on the curtain, was the reason the shield was still standing. The first shot had shattered the glass, but the subsequent ones were shattering the very foundation of the Kong dynasty, and as I huddled in the debris, I knew that if we survived the night, the world we stepped into would be unrecognizable. The sniper's red eye was still searching, the tactical team was advancing, and the king was firing back with the fury of a man who had been given a second chance by a ghost. The air was thick with the dust of the walls and the smoke of the gun, a gray veil that settled over the ruins of the dinner. Elena's screams had faded into a whimpering sob somewhere in the distance, but the sounds of the men on the balcony were getting closer, the rhythmic crunch of glass under tactical boots growing louder with every passing second. Jae-hyun shifted his weight, his arm tensing as he prepared for the next phase of the fight. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second. The image of the red laser burned into my eyelids, and when I opened them, I saw only the back of the man who had pulled me into the line of fire to save me. The glass was gone, the dinner was destroyed, and the invisible witness was now the only one left who knew the way out. We were trapped in a cage of mahogany and wind, waiting for the next crack of the rifle to tell us if we were still alive. It was the end of the beginning, and as the next bullet slammed into the table, the wood splinting near my hand, I realized that I wasn't just his shadow, I was his luck. And in this room, luck was the only thing more expensive than the wine. The transition was complete. The maid was a soldier, the boss was a target, and the penthouse was a tomb waiting for its inhabitants. But as Jae-hyun looked back at me one last time before lunging toward the next cover, his eyes told me one thing. We weren't going into that tomb tonight. Not if I kept my eyes on the shadows, and he kept his finger on the trigger. The glass had shattered, but we were still whole, held together by a crimson whisper and a hand of iron. The night was young, and the city was watching. The smoke from the muzzle flashes had not even begun to dissipate into the biting winter wind before the chime of the service elevator cut through the high-pitched ringing in my ears. It was a cheerful, domestic sound, a polite electronic announcement that felt utterly obscene in a room now filled with the stench of cordite, the biting chill of the night, and the shattered ruins of a kingdom. The elevator doors slid open with a smooth, mechanical hiss that seemed to mock the violence of the preceding seconds, and out stepped the architect of the evening's carnage. Min-jun stepped out of the lift with a casual grace, his polished leather shoes crunching over the fragments of crystal and bone china like a man walking through a garden after a light rain. He didn't look like an assassin or a usurper. He looked like a man coming home from a moderately successful day at the office, his expensive wool coat draped effortlessly over his arm and his silk tie perfectly knotted. But the way the tactical teams on the balcony shifted their aim away from our overturned mahogany fortress and toward the floor told me exactly who was holding the leash on this pack of wolves. Jae-hyun did not move from his position over me. I could feel the vibrating tension in his arm, the hard line of his tricep pressing against my shoulder like a shield made of living iron. He kept his weapon leveled at the elevator, his breathing deep and controlled, even as his brother stepped into the center of the gallery. The light from the chandelier, now swaying slightly from the muzzle blasts, cast long, flickering shadows that danced between the two men. Min-jun stopped 20 feet away, his gaze sweeping over the wreckage of the dinner table, the spilled wine that looked like arterial spray, and the woman in the red dress who was still whimpering in the corner. He didn't even look at me. To him, I was still just a piece of the architecture, a minor housekeeping detail that had somehow survived a demolition. He didn't realize that the detail was the only reason his brother's heart was still beating. "You always were too stubborn to die quietly, Jae-hyun," Min-jun said, his voice echoing through the vaulted gallery with a chilling, light-hearted quality that made the hair on my arms stand up. He sighed, a sound of mock disappointment, and tucked his hands into his pockets. "I told the boys to make it quick. I told them you deserved the dignity of a clean exit, but here you are, hiding behind a dinner table like a child playing at war. It's beneath you, truly." He took another step forward, the crunch of glass under his feet sounding like bone breaking. "But then again, you always did have a flair for the dramatic. Father always said you were the one born for the stage, while I was left to handle the backstage mess. Is this what it costs to buy your loyalty, Min-jun?" Jae-hyun's voice was a low, vibrating rumble that seemed to come from the very marrow of the building. He didn't lower his gun, and he didn't emerge from the cover of the mahogany. A few offshore accounts, a handful of hired guns from the docks, and a deal with the vultures circling our borders? I knew you were envious, but I didn't think you were this cheap. You've sold the family name for a pittance and a moment of borrowed authority. The fury in Jae-hyun's eyes was no longer the hot, impulsive rage of a man under fire. It was the cold, clinical assessment of a king realizing his own blood had become a cancer. Min-jun's smile didn't falter, but his eyes turned into chips of obsidian. "Cheap? No, Hae-jun. I'm simply efficient. I'm paying back a debt that has been accruing for 25 years. Do you remember the summer at the estate in Jeju? When father gave you the ring and told me I was the support? You were the sun, and I was the shadow meant to keep you from burning out. For 20 years, I have been the one cleaning up the blood you were too noble to see. I have been the one brokering the deals in the mud so you could sit in this glass tower and play the statesman." He gestured vaguely at the ruins of the penthouse. "This isn't a coup. It's an audit. And your accounts are empty, brother." He took another step, his gaze finally flickering to the corner of the crumpled ledger page that was still protruding from the pocket of Jae-hyun's jacket, the paper I had risked my life to deliver. I saw the moment the realization hit him, the way his pupils dilated as he connected the dots. The invisible maid hadn't just been cleaning the study, she had been reading the secrets he thought were buried under layers of digital encryption and locked drawers. He finally looked at me, and for the first time, I felt the full weight of a predator's attention. "You," he hissed, the lightheartedness vanishing from his tone like mist in a furnace. "I should have known. The girl who never looks up. You were the one who moved the pieces. She did more for this family in 10 seconds than you've done in a lifetime of resentment," Jae-hyun countered, his voice steady despite the 3 rifles still aimed at his chest from the balcony. He shifted his weight, shielding me more completely with his body. "You talk about debt, Min-jun? You just defaulted on the only one that mattered. Blood doesn't forgive a betrayal like this. You think these men will follow you once I'm gone? They follow strength, and you've shown them only that you can be bought by the highest bidder. Today, it's Elena's money. Tomorrow, it will be someone else's. Elena is a means to an end." Min-jun snapped, his composure finally beginning to fray at the edges. "She understands the price of power. She doesn't have your delusions of grandeur or your outdated code of ethics. The world doesn't want a man with a code anymore, Jae-hyun. It wants a man who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing." He raised a hand, a silent signal to the tactical team on the balcony. I saw the red lasers return, dancing across Jaehyun's chest and shoulders, searching for the killing shot. The standoff was absolute, a frozen moment in time where the history of two brothers was being weighed against the cold reality of lead and gunpowder. "You are always the smarter one, Minjun," Jaehyun said, his voice dropping to a whisper that only I and his brother could hear. "But you are never the stronger one. You think you've won because you've trapped me in a corner? You've forgotten the most important lesson Father taught us. A cornered animal is the only one that truly knows how to kill." In that fraction of a second, I saw the trigger finger on Jaehyun's hand tighten. I saw the flash of movement from the tactical team. I knew that the gallery was about to become a graveyard, and the history of the Kong family was about to be written in the blood of its sons. The air was thick with the scent of the end, a heavy, suffocating weight that made every heartbeat feel like a hammer blow against my ribs. Minjun took a final step, his face a mask of cold, unadulterated hatred. "Kill them," he commanded, his voice devoid of any fraternal warmth. "Kill them both. And make sure the maid goes first. I want my brother to watch his only witness die before the glass takes him too. I want him to understand that in the end, his nobility was his executioner." The command was given, the debt was called in, and the gallery exploded into motion once more. I closed my eyes as the first shot of the second wave rang out, praying that the shadows I had lived in for so long would finally rise up to protect us. The brothers' history was laid bare, a story of envy and blood, and as the darkness closed in, I realized that the only thing more dangerous than a brother's debt was a sister's resolve to survive it. The world was shattering, and as I felt Jaehyun's hand tighten on mine, I knew that the debt was about to be paid in full. The sound of the first rifle shot was like a crack of thunder in the small space, but Jaehyun was already moving, dragging me toward the service hallway before the bullet could find its mark. Minjun's scream of rage followed us into the darkness, a sound of a man realizing that his audit was far from over. We were no longer in the Gallery of Kings. We were in the veins of the building, the places where the invisible people lived. And in the dark, the king had a guide. I led him through the service doors, my feet knowing the way by touch alone, leaving the brothers and their blood-soaked history behind. The elevator hissed shut, the tactical team scrambled, and the debt remained unpaid, hanging in the air like the smoke of the muzzle flashes. The game had not ended, it had merely moved into the shadows, and in the shadows, I was the one who held the map. We were running, the king and the maid, through the cold, gray heart of the empire, while the brother who thought he had won was left standing in a room full of broken glass and empty promises. The night was far from over, and the debt was still accruing interest. The command to kill us had not even finished echoing through the vaulted gallery before Jaehyun acted with the terrifying, lethal grace of a man who had spent his entire life preparing for the end of it. He did not fire at his brother. Instead, he aimed for the overhead sprinkler system and the decorative glass partitions to our left. The explosion of water and crystalline shards created a momentary curtain of chaos, a silver fog that blinded the tactical sensors and scrambled the infrared sights for the 3 seconds we needed to vanish. "Follow my lead, or we both die in this kitchen," he growled, his hand clamping around mine. His grip was no longer just a restraint. It was a lifeline, his palm hot and calloused against my cold, trembling skin as he hauled me away from the mahogany fortress that had saved us. I did not head for the grand foyer or the armored front doors where the heavy weaponry was focused. Instead, I pulled back, my fingers digging into the expensive wool of his sleeve, anchoring him to the only escape route that didn't involve a body bag. "The service elevator is a kill box, and the stairs are crawled with them," I hissed over the sudden, piercing wail of the fire alarm that had begun to scream in time with the pounding of my heart. "But they do not know the bones of this building." "Ido." I led him into the industrial kitchen, slipping past the stainless steel prep tables where dinner sat abandoned and steaming, a grotesque testament to the luxury we were leaving behind. In the far corner, hidden behind a stack of heavy linen crates and a wall of industrial refrigeration units, was the narrow mouth of the maintenance hatch. To the residents of the penthouse, This was an invisible vein in the wall, a place for filters to be changed and pipes to be mended by people who didn't officially exist. To me, it was the only map I had ever been given, the secret geography of my daily labor. Jae-hyun hesitated for a heartbeat, his massive frame looking impossible against the cramped, dark opening of the galvanized steel tunnel. "Trust me," I whispered, the word feeling heavy and desperate in the humid air. "You hired me because I notice the things you do not. I know where this leads, and I know where they are not looking." He looked at the kitchen door as it began to buckle under the weight of the tactical team's breach, the sound of grinding metal and shouting men growing louder. Without another word, he shoved his handgun into his waistband and hauled himself into the gray, metallic throat of the building. I scrambled in after him, pulling the hatch shut and throwing the manual bolt just as the first flashbang detonated in the kitchen, the muffled thud vibrating through the steel floor beneath my knees. The tunnels were a labyrinth of shadow and cold air, smelling of dust, grease, and ozone. We moved in a rhythmic, agonizing crawl, the sounds of our breathing amplified by the narrow space until they sounded like the bellows of a forge. Above us, through the thin metal skin of the vents, we could hear the heavy, rhythmic thud of boots on the floorboards, the hunter searching for a ghost and a king who had vanished into the very walls that once housed them. Every few feet, a sliver of light would cut through a ventilation grate, illuminating the soot on Jae-hyun's face and the grim set of his jaw. We were moving through the gray, that twilight world of pipes and wires that kept the Kong Empire functioning while remaining entirely unseen. I led him through the primary HVAC junction, where the air was whipped into a frenzy by massive turbines that sounded like the roar of a jet engine. This was my sanctuary, the place where I had spent years avoiding the temper of the housekeeper and the cold stares of the guests. I knew which pipes ran hot and which could be used as handholds. I knew the exact rhythm of the pressure release valves that would mask the sound of our movement. We reached a vertical shaft where a rusted ladder descended into the darkness, a vertical plummet toward the foundations of the skyscraper. "It's 60 feet down to the sub-basement," I whispered, my voice caught in the roar of the fans. "The sensors down there are old, Manuel. Minjun's tech team won't have the override codes because they never bothered to upgrade the basement security. They forgot about the ground." Jae-hyun began the descent first, his movements methodical and quiet, his eyes never leaving the darkness below. I followed, my hands slick with the grime of the shaft, the world shrinking down to the rhythmic clatter of our boots on the rungs. We were descending from the heights of a god to the depths of a machine, stripping away the pretenses of the penthouse 1 foot at a time. The air grew colder, damp with the smell of the city's underbelly and the ancient concrete of the foundation. When we finally reached the bottom, we emerged into a narrow utility corridor that ran parallel to the main sewer lines. It was a place of dripping water and scurrying shadows, a stark contrast to the marble and silk we had fled. Jae-hyun stood up, wiping the grease from his palms onto his trousers, his presence still commanding even in the dismal light of a single, flickering fluorescent bulb. He looked at me, and for the first time, the predatory sharpness of his gaze was tempered by a profound, silent realization. "You've been navigating these shadows for 3 years, haven't you, Amara?" he asked, his voice a low rasp that echoed against the damp walls. He looked around the dismal corridor as if seeing a new continent for the first time. He had built the tower, but he had never known the dirt it was planted in. "The invisibles see everything, Mr. Kong," I replied, my voice steadying as the immediate threat of the tactical team faded into the distance. "It is time you learned how to be invisible, too. They're looking for a man in a charcoal suit in a high-rise. They are not looking for a man in the mud." I led him toward a heavy iron door that marked the boundary of the property, the final exit into the labyrinth of the city's maintenance tunnels. Beyond this door lay the gray of the city itself, the subways, the utility vaults, and the forgotten passages that connected the skyscrapers like a subterranean web. As I reached for the handle, Jae-hyun stopped me, his hand catching my wrist. It wasn't the violent grip from the gallery. It was something else, a tether. "Why did you come back for me?" he asked. "In the kitchen, you could have gone through the hatch alone. You could have been gone before they even broke the door." Why risk bringing a target with you? I looked at him, really looked at him, in the dim, sickly light of the sub-basement. I saw the man who had been betrayed by everyone he loved, the man who was currently holding the weight of an empire on his bruised shoulders. Because the ledger didn't just tell me you were being robbed, I said softly. It told me you were being erased. And I know what it feels like to be someone the world wants to erase. I wasn't going to let them do it to you, too. He stared at me for a long moment, the silence of the tunnel filled only by the distant drip of water. Then, he nodded once, a gesture of absolute alliance. We stepped through the iron door and into the vast, echoing silence of the city's maintenance network. Here, the world was a series of concrete catacombs, lit by the occasional red glow of an exit sign or the orange hum of a high-voltage cable. I led him through a series of intersecting tunnels, each one looking identical to the untrained eye, but marked for me by the subtle variations in the masonry and the smell of the air. We were ghosts in the machinery, moving beneath the feet of the millions of people who lived in the light, unaware of the war being fought in the dark. We walked for miles, our footsteps muffled by the layer of dust that coated everything, until we reached a nondescript steel ladder that led up to a heavy manhole cover in a forgotten alleyway 3 districts over. The climb was slow, our muscles screaming with the fatigue of the night, but when we finally pushed the cover aside, the air that hit us was fresh and bitingly cold. We emerged into an alleyway choked with trash and the shadows of 100 brick buildings, miles away from the glass tower and the brothers who were likely still tearing it apart in search of us. The city hummed around us, the distant sound of traffic and sirens a familiar, comforting roar. Jae-hyun stood in the alley, his white shirt gray with soot, his charcoal trousers ruined, and his eyes reflecting the neon glow of a nearby sign. He looked like a man who had died and been reborn in a single night. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the crumpled ledger page I had given him, smoothed it out with his thumb, and then looked at me. The penthouse is gone, he said, but the empire is still in these numbers. And the man who stole it still thinks I'm a ghost. He looked at the alleyway, then back at the manhole cover we had just exited. They won't find us here, I said, pulling my thin cardigan tighter against the chill. This part of the city doesn't have cameras, and the people who live here don't talk to men in suits. We are in the gray now, Mr. Kong. And in the gray, I am the one who knows the rules. He nodded, a slow, deliberate movement that acknowledged the shift in our dynamic. The king had been dethroned, and the maid had become his guide. We started walking, 2 shadows among many, disappearing into the heart of the city's underbelly where the invisible lived and died every day. The night was far from over, but for the first time since the first shot rang out, the air didn't smell like gunpowder. It smelled like the future, uncertain, cold, and entirely ours to write. We moved through the urban labyrinth, weaving through the discarded remains of the day's commerce, until the tower was nothing more than a distant, glowing needle in the sky. Behind us, the tunnels remained silent, keeping the secret of our escape. Ahead of us lay the cold safe house and the long, hard road back to the light. But for now, the gray was enough. It was the only place we could breathe, and in the silence of the city's veins, the invisible witness and the fallen king began to plan their return. The world above was still looking for a man in a suit. They would never expect the ghost rising from the dirt. We walked until the dawn began to smudge the edges of the buildings, 2 souls bound by blood, linen, and the secrets of the vents. The game hadn't ended. It had just moved to a level where the brothers could never follow. Into the gray we went, and into the gray we disappeared, leaving the echoes of the shattered glass far behind us in the heights. The chill of the sub-basement clung to us like a second skin, a damp, oily frost that seemed to seep through the expensive wool of Jae-hyun's ruined jacket and the thin, starched cotton of my maid's uniform. As we stepped out of the maintenance alley and into the biting reality of the Chicago night, the city felt different, larger, louder, and infinitely more predatory. For Jae-hyun, this was no longer a kingdom to be viewed from the safe, tempered glass distance of a penthouse. It was a concrete maze where every flickering streetlight was a potential spotter and every idling sedan was a hearse waiting for its passenger. He stood in the mouth of the alley, his breath blooming in white plumes, his eyes darting toward the main thoroughfare with the instinct of a man who usually had a convoy of armored SUVs to bridge the gap between buildings. He looked out at the world as if he were seeing it for the first time without the protective filter of wealth, and I saw the moment he realized that his power had remained behind in the shattered glass of the gallery. Here, in the salt-stained shadows of the West Side, his name carried no weight, and his charcoal suit was merely a beacon for the wrong kind of attention. "We cannot stay on the main streets," I whispered, my voice caught in the rhythmic rattle of the elevated train passing overhead. The sound was deafening, a grinding roar of steel on steel that vibrated through the pavement and into the soles of my boots. Jae-hyun reached for his weapon, his hand instinctively hovering over the small of his back, but I stepped in front of him, my hand catching his wrist. The contact was brief, but firm. "No. If you pull that, you invite the police, and your brother's men are likely listening to their scanners. You aren't a king tonight, Mr. Kong. You're a ghost. And ghosts don't carry chrome-plated hardware in plain sight." I could see the struggle in his flint-gray eyes, the habit of command warring with the cold necessity of the present. He slowly lowered his hand, his posture shifting from the rigid stance of a target to the wary, hunched shadow of a survivor. He followed me into the dark, leaving the neon glow of the convenience stores behind for the gray, unlit veins of the industrial district. This was the geography of the Overlooked, a map I had memorized during the long years before I ever stepped foot into the Kong penthouse. I knew the rhythm of these streets, the way the shadows pooled under the rusted fire escapes, and the specific smell of a dead-end alleyway. Jae-hyun moved with a stiff, military precision that made him stand out like a sore thumb. He was too alert, his movements too controlled for someone who belonged in the dirt. "Walk like you're tired," I hissed, leaning into him to mask our conversation from a group of figures huddled around a burning trash can a block away. "Slump your shoulders. You aren't scanning for snipers. You're looking for a place to sleep. If you look like you're hunting, you become the prey." He didn't argue. I felt the tension bleed out of his frame, a deliberate collapse of his ego that must have cost him more than the millions Elena had siphoned from his accounts. He leaned into me, his weight heavy and real, playing the part of a broken man while his eyes remained sharp as glass behind the facade. We navigated through a series of interconnected lots, scaling a chain-link fence that tore a jagged strip from my apron, a final piece of the uniform's sacrifice to the city. I led him toward a nondescript brick building that sat in the shadow of a derelict warehouse, its windows boarded with plywood and its entrance obscured by a pile of discarded pallets. This was the safe house I had kept in the back of my mind since the day I realized that working for a man like Jae-hyun was a terminal occupation. It wasn't a high-tech bunker with biometric scanners. It was a cold, one-room flat registered to a name that didn't exist, paid for in cash siphoned from the household grocery budget over 3 years. I fumbled with the rusted padlock, the metallic scrape sounding like a gunshot in the quiet of the alley, before the heavy iron door groaned open. The air inside was stale and smelled of dry rot and old newsprint, but it was silent, and more importantly, it was opaque. I didn't turn on the lights. I led him through the darkness to a small, lumpy mattress in the corner, the only piece of furniture in the room. Jae-hyun sat down, the springs of the bed shrieking in protest under his weight, and for the first time since the first shot rang out, he let his head fall into his hands. The silence of the safe house was a heavy, suffocating thing, filled only by the distant, rhythmic drip of a leaky pipe and the frantic thudding of my own heart. I moved to the window, peering through a crack in the plywood to watch the street below. A black SUV cruised slowly past the entrance of the alley, its headlights cutting through the dark like searchlights, and I held my breath until the red tail lights vanished around the corner. "They won't find us here," I said, my voice sounding thin and brittle in the emptiness of the room. I turned back to him, watching the way the moonlight filtered through the cracks in the boards, casting long, prison bar shadows across his face. He looked at his hands, blackened with soot and grease, then up at me. He was stripped of his palace, his guards, and his brother's loyalty, left with nothing but the maid he had ignored and a room that cost $40 a week. "You had a plan for this," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "You didn't just notice the ledgers, Amara. You prepared for the fall. Why?" He stood up, his height filling the cramped space, moving toward me with a slow, deliberate gravity. "Because in my world, the floor is always falling out," I replied, meeting his gaze with a steady, unblinking focus. "I watched you build that tower, Mr. Kong, but I also watched the way your brother looked at you when you weren't looking. I watched the way Elena smiled at the bank statements more than she smiled at you. I knew the glass would shatter eventually. I just didn't know it would be tonight." I moved toward a small wooden crate in the corner, pulling out a first aid kit and a bottle of cheap antiseptic. He had a grazing wound on his shoulder, a shallow, angry furrow where a shard of glass or a stray bullet had found him in the gallery. I didn't ask permission. I simply began to peel back the ruined charcoal fabric of his shirt. The intimacy of the act was a jarring contrast to the violence of the night. My fingers were cold, but his skin was burning, the heat of his adrenaline still coursing through his veins. As I cleaned the wound, he didn't flinch, but I could feel the way his muscles tensed under my touch, a predator allowing itself to be tended to by the only creature it didn't fear. "You have street smarts, Amara," he murmured, his eyes never leaving my face. "You navigate the underbelly better than my head of security ever could." He was looking for threats in the digital clouds. You were looking for them in the dirt. He reached out, his hand hovering near my jaw, his fingers tracing the line of a small cut I hadn't even realized I had. "My brother thinks he has won because he has the keys to the penthouse. He doesn't realize that the penthouse is just a cage. The city belongs to the people who can survive in the gray. We need to move again before dawn," I said, ignoring the electricity that sparked between us at the touch. "Minjun will start checking the low-rent districts once he realizes we didn't leave the city. He knows I'm with you, and he knows I don't have the resources to take you far." I finished bandaging his shoulder, the white gauze stark against his tan skin. "But he doesn't know about the tunnels under the old rail yard. If we can get there, we can get across the canal. I have a friend who runs a scrap yard. He doesn't ask questions, and he hates your brother more than he loves money." Jae-hyun nodded, a slow, deliberate movement that signaled his total reliance on my navigation. He was no longer the architect. He was the passenger, and the realization seemed to settle over him with a grim, quiet acceptance. He stood up, testing the range of motion in his shoulder, his presence once again filling the room with a dangerous, quiet energy. He looked at the first aid kit, then at me, and I saw the flint in his eyes turn into something sharper, something more enduring than simple rage. "Minjun thinks he has defaulted on my debt," Jae-hyun said, his voice dropping to that low, tectonic frequency that usually preceded a corporate execution. "He thinks he has erased me. But he has only made me like you, Amara. Invisible. And an invisible man with a ledger is the most dangerous thing in this city." He walked to the window, mirroring my earlier stance, his silhouette a dark, jagged shadow against the boarded glass. "We go to the rail yard. We find your friend. And then we start picking apart his empire brick by brick." The night outside was starting to turn that deep, bruised purple that precedes the dawn, the coldest hour of the 24. I gathered the few supplies I had stashed, a burner phone, a stack of small-denomination bills, and a map of the city's forgotten utility lines. I felt a strange, hollow sense of power as I handed him a heavy, hooded sweatshirt I had kept in the crate, a garment meant to hide the charcoal suit and the man beneath it. As he pulled it on, the transition was complete. The king of the Kong Empire had vanished, replaced by a shadow in a hoodie, a man who looked like he belonged in the safe house. He looked at me, and for a heartbeat, the distance between us was gone. We were just two souls in a cold room, waiting for the sun to rise so we could go back into the war. "Amara," he said, stopping me at the door. "When this is over, when I am back in that tower, things will not go back to the way they were. You aren't a ghost anymore." I didn't answer. I couldn't. The future was a blurry, distorted thing, seen through the lens of a sniper's scope and the cracks of a boarded window. I simply turned the handle and stepped out into the alleyway, the cold Chicago air hitting me like a physical blow. The safe house had served its purpose, providing a few hours of stagnant peace, but the city was waking up and the hunters would be hungry. I led him through the maze of the industrial district, weaving through the discarded remains of the night's commerce, toward the rusted, skeletal remains of the rail yard. We were moving through the underbelly, two ghosts in the machinery of a city that didn't care if we lived or died. But as long as I held the map and he held the gun, we were the most dangerous things in the gray. The rail yard loomed ahead, a forest of blackened steel and rotting timber, a place where the light of the city didn't dare to reach. It was the perfect place for a king to hide, and an even better place for a maid to lead an army. We slipped through a hole in the perimeter fence, the sound of the city fading behind us as we entered the silent, echoing graveyard of the trains. Here, the rules were different, and the shadows were our only friends. I felt Jae-hyun's hand on my shoulder, a steadying weight in the dark, and I knew that the debt was being paid in a currency Min-jun would never understand. We were moving, we were surviving, and in the cold, gray heart of the Chicago underbelly, the new order was already beginning to take shape. The penthouse was a memory. The rail yard was our reality. And as the first light of dawn touched the top of the skyscrapers in the distance, we disappeared into the rusted bowels of the yard, leaving no trace for the wolves to follow. The king had relied on his guards and lost. Now, he was relying on the girl who knew the dirt, and for the first time, he was winning. We were deep in the gray now, and the gray was ours. The morning was coming, but the shadows were still long enough to hide a revolution. I took a breath of the cold, metallic air and kept moving, the weight of the city on my back and the king at my side. The underbelly had opened its mouth, and we had walked right in, ready to use its teeth against the brothers who thought they owned the world. The night was over, but the war had only just found its rhythm, a heartbeat in the dark that promised a reckoning. The cold of the safe house was a living thing, a biting, stagnant frost that seemed to emanate from the very brickwork of the abandoned tenement. We were miles from the glass spires of the loop, tucked into the skeletal remains of an industrial district where the streetlights had long ago surrendered to the dark. Inside the small, windowless room, the only light came from a single, low-wattage bulb overhead that hummed with a sickly, yellow vibration. It cast jagged, elongated shadows across the floor, a stark contrast to the soft, recessed glow of the penthouse. Here, there was no silk, no marble, and no distance. There was only the smell of old newsprint, the rhythmic drip of a leaky pipe in the hallway, and the heavy, ragged sound of Jae-hyun's breathing. He sat on the edge of the lumpy, stained mattress I had dragged from a corner, his frame still possessed of a kingly gravity even as his charcoal suit jacket lay discarded on the floor like a molted skin. The white of his dress shirt was no longer pristine. A jagged, blossoming stain of crimson had claimed the left shoulder, the silk weeping as the blood began to cool and stiffen. He hadn't complained during the miles of walking through the maintenance tunnels or the frantic scramble across the rail yards, but now, in the silence of our temporary sanctuary, the adrenaline was receding, leaving behind the raw, pulsing reality of the flesh. I stood before him, still clad in the tattered remains of my maid's uniform, the apron smudged with soot and grease. My hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from the sudden, terrifying proximity to the man who had been a remote, untouchable deity in my world only hours before. I reached into the small wooden crate I had stashed months ago, a secret kit of basic necessities, and pulled out a bottle of cheap antiseptic, a roll of gauze, and a basin of tepid water. "Let me see it," I whispered. The words felt too loud in the cramped space, a breach of the invisible contract that had governed our relationship for 3 years. Jae-hyun didn't look up immediately. His head was bowed, his dark hair falling over his brow, shielding his eyes. He looked like a fallen titan, a man whose empire had been reduced to the reach of his own arms. Slowly, he reached for the buttons of his shirt with his right hand. His fingers, usually so precise and commanding when signing million-dollar contracts, fumbled against the blood-slicked fabric. I didn't wait for him to finish. I stepped into the narrow space between his knees, my breath hitching as I felt the radiant heat of his body. I began to undo the buttons for him, my movements clinical yet trembling, peeling the ruined silk away from his skin with the practiced care of someone used to handling delicate things. When the shirt fell away, the physical barrier between us vanished, replaced by a raw, human vulnerability that the penthouse had never allowed. His torso was a map of disciplined muscle and hidden scars, but the new wound was a violent intrusion. A piece of glass or a tumbling bullet had furrowed a deep, angry path across the crest of his shoulder. It wasn't fatal, but it was deep, the edges jagged and weeping. I dipped a clean cloth into the basin, the water turning a pale, sickly pink as I began to dapple away the dried blood. I felt him flinch, a sharp, involuntary hitch in his chest, and I paused, my eyes meeting his for the first time in the stillness. His gray eyes were no longer the cold, distant stones that watched me from across the study. They were wide, reflecting the yellow light and a profound, quiet exhaustion. "I'm sorry," I murmured, my voice barely a thread of sound. I returned to the task, my fingers brushing against the heat of his collarbone. "It needs to be cleaned, or the fever will take you before your brother does." I poured the antiseptic onto the wound, and Jae-hyun let out a low, guttural hiss, his hand coming up instinctively to grip my forearm. His hold was desperate, a vice made of heat and bone that anchored me to him. For a moment, we were frozen in that pose, the maid and the master, bound together by a bottle of cheap alcohol and the shared terror of the night. The emotional wall I had built over 3 years, the wall of yes, sir, and no, sir, the wall of downcast eyes and silent footsteps, cracked and fell away in the damp air of the safe house. He wasn't a king anymore, and I wasn't a ghost. We were just 2 animals hiding in a burrow, trying to survive the winter. As I began to wrap the gauze around his shoulder, my movements became more rhythmic, a domestic ritual adapted for a battlefield. I had to lean in close to pass the roll behind his back, my chest nearly brushing against his as I worked. I could smell the gunpowder on him, the scent of the city's rain, and underneath it all, the clean, masculine scent of the man himself. It was overwhelming, a sensory invasion that made the small room feel even smaller. "You have steady hands, Amara," he said, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that I felt in my own ribcage. It was the first time he had used my name without the sharp edge of a command. Where did a maid learn to stitch the world back together? I didn't look up, focusing instead on the way the white linen of the bandage stood out against his tan skin. "When you live in the shadows, Mr. Kong, you learn to fix your own breaks," I replied softly. "No one comes to the basement to check for wounds. You learn to be your own doctor, your own mechanic, and your own priest." I tucked the end of the gauze into the wrap, my fingers lingering for a second longer than necessary against the smooth skin of his back. The contact sent a jolt of something electric and terrifying through me, a realization that the hierarchy of our lives had been permanently inverted. He was the one who was vulnerable now, and I was the one who held the power of care. I stepped back, intending to put distance between us, but his hand didn't let go of my arm. He pulled me back toward him, not with force, but with a silent, heavy gravity that was impossible to resist. "The ledger," he said, his eyes searching mine. "Why did you keep it? You could have sold those numbers to Minjun for enough money to leave this city forever. You could have been free of the Kangs, free of the laundry and the silence. Why bring it to me?" I looked at the basin of pink water, at the ruined shirt on the floor, and then back at him. The truth was a jagged thing, harder to handle than the glass in the penthouse. "Because you are the only one who never looked at me with pity," I said. Minjun looked at me and saw an appliance. Elena looked at me and saw a mirror for her own vanity. But you looked at me and saw nothing at all. And in this house, being nothing was the only form of respect I was ever given. I didn't want to see that erased. He let out a short, dry laugh that sounded like the rustle of dead leaves. "I looked at you and saw a ghost, Tamara. I see now that I was the one who was haunted." He reached out with his good hand, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw, wiping away a smudge of soot I hadn't noticed. The touch was light, almost tentative, a complete departure from the man who had flipped a mahogany table to save my life. In that moment, the safe house didn't feel like a prison. It felt like a crucible. Everything that was false about our lives had been burned away in the gallery, leaving only this: the blood on the linen, the hum of the light bulb, and the weight of two people who had finally recognized each other in the dark. The barrier wasn't just broken, it was gone, leaving us exposed to a future that neither of us had planned for. I took the basin and stood up, the water sloshing against the sides as I moved to the small sink in the corner. My heart was still hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a reminder that the world outside was still hunting us. "You need to rest," I said, my back to him as I poured the pink water down the drain. "The rail yard is a few hours away, and we need to move before the first shift of workers arrives. Minjun will be scouring the hospitals and the hotels. He won't think to look in the gray." I heard the bed creak as he shifted, the sound of a man settling into a new reality. He didn't answer, but the silence was no longer the heavy, oppressive thing it had been. It was a shared space, a pause in the violence where we could simply exist without the burden of our titles. I turned back to see him leaning against the wall, the white bandage stark and clean on his shoulder. He looked like a warrior from an older, more brutal era, stripped of his modern armor and left with only his will. "Amara," he said as I moved to sit on the floor by the door, my back against the cold wood to act as a sentry. "If we survive the morning, if I take back the tower, I won't let you go back to the shadows. A ghost who saves a king deserves more than a basement." I looked at him, the yellow light catching the grit in his eyes, and I felt a strange, hollow ache in my chest. The world he was talking about, the world of towers and empires, seemed a lifetime away. Right now, the only thing that mattered was the warmth of the room and the fact that we were still breathing. "Let's just survive the night first, Jae-hyun," I whispered, using his name for the first time. The sound of it felt like a transgression, a final shattering of the glass. He nodded, his eyes closing as the exhaustion finally claimed him, his head resting against the rough brick of the wall. I sat in the dark, my hand resting on the cold iron of the door handle, watching the rise and fall of his chest. The blood on the linen was drying, the antiseptic was stinging, and the city was waiting for the sun to rise so it could begin the hunt again. But for now, in the heart of the gray, the barrier was gone. We were no longer master and maid. We were the only two people in the world who knew the truth, and that truth was more dangerous than any bullet. I stayed awake, a ghost guarding a king, while the shadows danced on the wall and the morning crept slowly toward the broken windows of Chicago. The night stretched on, the silence of the safe house occasionally punctuated by the distant moan of a siren or the rattle of a passing truck. Each sound made me tense, my fingers tightening on the handle, but the door remained closed. Jae-hyun's breathing leveled out into a deep, steady cadence, the sleep of a man who had finally surrendered to the inevitable. I found myself watching the way the light played across the bandage I had applied, a small patch of order in a world that had descended into chaos. I realized then that I wasn't just protecting him, I was protecting the version of myself that had finally been seen. The linen was stained, the blood was real, and the future was a jagged cliff edge, but as I sat there in the cold, I knew I wouldn't change a single second of the shatter. The glass was broken, but for the first time, I could see clearly. We were in the gray, and the gray was where we would find our strength. I leaned my head against the door, closing my eyes for just a moment, listening to the heartbeat of the man I had saved, while the city breathed its cold, indifferent breath outside our walls. The debt was being paid, the barrier was gone, and the dawn was coming, whether we were ready for it or not. As the first gray smudge of light began to leak through the cracks in the doorframe, I stood up, my joints stiff from the vigil. I moved to the bed and touched his hand, the same hand that had gripped mine in the gallery. "It's time," I whispered. He was awake instantly, his eyes snapping open with a clarity that told me he had never truly let go of the fight. He looked at the bandage, then at me, and stood up with a grim determination. The suit jacket stayed on the floor, a relic of a dead man. He stepped toward the door, and I followed, our shadows merging on the wall for one brief second before we stepped out into the biting chill of the morning. The hunt was on, the Empire was waiting, and the blood on the linen was the only map we had left. We disappeared into the fog of the industrial district, two ghosts walking toward a reckoning, leaving the cold safe house to the dust and the memories of the night the glass finally broke. The gray dampness of the rail yard had begun to settle into my marrow, a cold that no amount of walking could quite shake. Beside me, Jae-hyun moved with a new kind of silence, his presence no longer the heavy, imposing weight of a billionaire, but the focused, predatory stillness of a man who had finally seen the shape of the blade at his throat. We reached the scrap yard at the edge of the industrial canal just as the sky began to turn a bruised, sickly purple. My contact, a man named Juan who dealt in secrets as often as he dealt in rusted iron, didn't blink when he saw the king of the Kong Empire standing in his oil-stained office. He simply gestured to a battered, ancient laptop sitting on a grease-slicked desk and stepped outside to smoke, leaving us with the digital keys to the kingdom we had just fled. The room smelled of ozone and stale coffee, a far cry from the sandalwood and high-altitude air of the penthouse, but it was here, in the grime, that the ledger's truth began to breathe. Jae-hyun's fingers moved over the keys with a frantic, mechanical precision. He didn't need to look at the notes anymore. The numbers were burned into his retinas from the hours we had spent in the safe house. I stood behind him, my hand resting on the back of his chair, watching as the blue light of the monitor reflected in the hard, flinty depths of his eyes. We weren't just looking for stolen funds. We were looking for the motive, the why behind a brother's betrayal that felt too theatrical, too clumsy for a man as calculated as Min-jun. As the screen flickered, a web of offshore accounts began to unfurl, a digital map of the theft that had been hidden behind layers of shell companies and fake investments. I watched the names of the banks scroll by: Cayman, Zurich, Singapore, a trail of breadcrumbs that led directly into the heart of the Kong family's internal accounts. But as the data began to clarify, as the encryptions fell away under Jae-hyun's relentless hacking, the pattern began to shift. "This isn't Min-jun's signature," Jae-hyun whispered, his voice a low vibration that seemed to come from the floorboards. He pointed to a recurring authorization code, a tiny string of alphanumeric characters that appeared at the end of every major transfer. "Min-jun is arrogant. He uses his birth date, his initials, or symbols of the power he thinks he's earned. These codes, they're different. They're feminine. They're precise in a way my brother never was." He scrolled further, his jaw tightening until the bones stood out in sharp relief against his soot-stained skin. I leaned closer, my eyes scanning the rows of dates and figures. I noticed a pattern that he, in his fury, might have missed: the timing. Every transfer happened exactly 48 hours after a social event, a dinner, or a gala where the woman in the red dress had been at Jae-hyun's side.
Elena.
The realization hit me like a physical blow, a cold wave of clarity that made the air in the cramped office feel thin. I remembered the way she had looked in the gallery, her red gown a splash of blood against the white linen, her scream sounding just a little too practiced, her eyes scanning the room not for an exit, but for the effect of the violence. I remembered the way she had smiled at the bank statements in the study when she thought I wasn't looking, a smile that had more to do with the hunger of a wolf than the affection of a lover. "It wasn't Min-jun," I said, my voice barely a thread of sound in the hum of the cooling fans. "He's the hammer, Mr. Kong, but he isn't the hand. Look at the diverted interest rates. They aren't going to Min-jun's private holdings. They're being routed through a secondary trust in the name of a foundation he doesn't even have access to." Jae-hyun tapped a final key, and a document appeared on the screen. A private contract for a buyout that would effectively dismantle the Kong Empire and sell its assets to a rival conglomerate in Europe. The signature at the bottom of the digital file wasn't Min-jun's sprawling, ego-driven scrawl. It was a neat, elegant script that I had seen 1,000 times on invitations and thank you notes.
Elena Vance.
The woman who had sat at his table, drank his wine, and worn his protection like a cloak while she systematically stripped the foundations of his world. Min-jun wasn't the mastermind. He was the distraction, the resentful brother she had groomed and manipulated to take the fall, while she prepared to walk away with the wreckage. She had played them both, using Minjun's envy as a weapon to destroy the only man who could have stopped her. She used him. Jae-hyun hissed, the words dripping with a venomous realization. He slammed his fist onto the desk, making the ancient laptop rattle. He thinks he's taking the throne, but she's just clearing the boards so she can sell the table. He stood up, the chair scraping harshly against the concrete floor. The emotional toll of the night finally seemed to crest over him. The betrayal of a brother was a wound, but the betrayal of the woman he had allowed into his inner sanctum was a poison. I watched the light change in his eyes, the grief being subsumed by a cold, calculating rage that was far more dangerous. He wasn't just a hunted man anymore. He was a man who had found the true source of the fire. The woman in the red dress wasn't a victim of the chaos in the penthouse. She was the architect of the pyre. I looked at the screen, at the cold, hard evidence of her duplicity. She's still at the penthouse, I said, the thought chilling me. Or she's with Minjun, convincing him that you're dead so he'll sign the final authorizations. He's the only one with the family codes she needs to complete the transfer. Once he signs those over to her, trust, he's as dead as he wanted you to be. She won't leave a witness like him alive once he's served his purpose. I saw the way Jae-hyun's hand went to the grip of his handgun. The ledger had provided the truth, but the truth had provided a deadline. We had thought we were running to save our lives, but now we were running to stop a slaughter that would end the Kong name forever. Elena wasn't pulling strings. She was tightening a noose around both brothers' necks. She thinks she's invisible because she's beautiful, Jae-hyun said, turning toward the door, his silhouette a sharp, jagged edge against the morning light. She thinks people like you and me are just tools to be used and discarded. He stopped and looked back at me, his expression unreadable. But she forgot that the maid sees the stains before the guests do. You saw her, Amara. You saw the truth before I did. He reached out and squeezed my shoulder, a brief, heavy contact that felt like a vow. We left the scrap yard office, the smell of the canal and the cold Chicago wind hitting us as we stepped back into the world of the gray. The city was waking up, the first buses rumbling through the streets, but the war had moved into a new phase. We weren't just survivors anymore. We were the reckoning. As we moved back toward the tunnels, the weight of the ledger's truth sat heavy in the pocket of my cardigan. I realized then that my role as the invisible witness was over. I had seen the dots on the paper, I had seen the brother's debt, and now I had seen the woman behind the mask. The red dress was a warning, a signal of the blood she was willing to spill to get what she wanted. We walked in silence, the rhythm of our footsteps synchronized, two ghosts moving through a city that still thought the king was dead. The empire was crumbling, the glass was shattered, and the woman in the red dress was waiting to collect the pieces. But she didn't know that the maid was no longer watching from the shadows. I was walking beside the king, and we were coming for the truth. The journey back through the maintenance corridors felt different now. The fear was still there, a sharp, metallic tang in the back of my throat, but it was directed, focused into a single point of purpose. We moved through the steam-filled utility vaults and the dripping concrete passages, the sound of our breathing the only music in the dark. Jae-hyun didn't stumble. He didn't hesitate. The knowledge of Elena's betrayal had acted like a cauterization on his wounds, hardening his resolve into something unbreakable. He was no longer the man who had sat at the head of the table, burdened by the expectations of his name. He was a man with nothing left to lose but the truth, and that made him the most dangerous predator in the city. I followed him, the girl who knew the dirt, leading the man who had built the sky, both of us moving toward a confrontation that would decide the fate of everything. We reached the junction that led back toward the loop, the heart of the machine. I could feel the vibration of the city above us, the thousands of people starting their day, unaware that the world they knew was being dismantled by a woman in a red dress. We have to get to Minjun before she does, Jae-hyun said, his voice echoing in the narrow space. He's at the secondary office in the North Tower. It's the only place with a secure terminal he needs to finalize the trust transfers. He looked at me, his eyes searching for the map I held in my head. Can you get us there without being seen? Can you get us into the North Tower through the vents? I nodded, the cold steel of the ventilation grate already familiar beneath my fingertips. I can get you anywhere, Jae-hyun. I'm the one who cleans the floors. I know every door that doesn't lock. The plan was a desperate, jagged thing, born of necessity and the cold reality of the ledger's numbers. We were heading back into the fire, back into the world of glass and steel where the hunters were waiting. But the dynamic had shifted. Elena thought she was playing a game of chess against a dead man and a fool, but she had forgotten about the piece she had never even bothered to name. I was the maid, the invisible witness, the girl who had noticed the red dress was the color of a warning. And as we climbed the final ladder toward the heart of the Kong Empire, I knew that the morning would bring a reckoning that the penthouse had never seen. The truth was out. The lines were drawn, and the woman pulling the strings was about to find out that some ghosts refused to stay buried. We pushed open the final hatch, the sound of the city rushing in to greet us, and stepped back into the war, ready to burn the red dress to ash and take back the kingdom from the shadows. The morning sun was a pale, weak sliver over the lake as we emerged into the service alley of the North Tower. The building loomed above us, a monolith of silver and glass that looked indifferent to the lives being broken inside it. Jae-hyun adjusted the hood of his sweatshirt, his face hidden in the shadows, his hand resting on the weapon at his side. He looked like a revolutionary, a man prepared to tear down the very thing he had spent a lifetime creating. I took a breath of the cold air, feeling the weight of the ledger in my pocket one last time. This was the end of the silence. This was the moment the invisible became seen. We stepped into the service entrance, the familiar hum of the freight elevator welcoming us back into the machine. The woman in the red dress was waiting, but so were we. The ledger's truth was our weapon, and as the elevator began its ascent, I knew that the Empire would never be the same again. The glass was already shattered. Now, it was time to find out who would bleed the most on the shards. We rose toward the light, two ghosts with a purpose, while the city turned its blind eyes toward the sky, waiting for the king to fall or the maid to rise. The red dress was a target, and we were the ones with the sight. The debt was being called, and Elena Vance was about to find out that the price of betrayal was higher than even she could afford. The elevator doors opened, and the final act began in the silence of the North Tower, where the money trail ended and the blood began to flow. The heavy, humid air of the subterranean vault felt like a physical weight, thick with the scent of old parchment, cold steel, and the metallic tang of high-voltage security systems. We were standing in the belly of the Kong Private Bank, a neoclassical fortress of granite and gold that sat like a silent gargoyle in the heart of the financial district. Above us, the city was just beginning to stir with the false promise of a peaceful morning, but down here, in the windowless sanctuary of the family's wealth, the only clock that mattered was the one counting down the final seconds of an empire. Jae-hyun stood beside me, his form a dark, jagged silhouette against the polished brass of the elevator doors. He had shed the ruined charcoal jacket, standing now in a plain black tactical turtleneck he had scavenged from the safe house, but his eyes still carried the terrifying, cold clarity of a man who had seen his own execution and walked away from it. He looked at me, and for a heartbeat, the master-made dynamic flickered back into existence, not as a cage, but as a weapon. "This is the heart of the machine, Amara," he whispered, his voice a low vibration that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my chest. Minjun and Elena are already inside the primary terminal room. They think they're performing a routine audit to stabilize the assets before the news of my death breaks. They need the physical override keys that only exist in this vault to finalize the offshore transfers. I nodded, my hand tightening around the small, leather-bound folder that contained my maid clearance, a collection of bypass codes, service keys, and biometric overrides that the security team had given me years ago so I could clean the sensitive areas without triggering the silent alarms. To them, I was a part of the plumbing, a harmless ghost who polished the sensors and dusted the cameras. They had never imagined that the ghost had been memorizing the architecture of their downfall. I stepped forward, my soft-soled service shoes making no sound on the white marble floor. I was no longer wearing the tattered uniform. I had changed into a sharp, inconspicuous gray blazer and trousers, but I carried the same aura of deferential invisibility that had protected me for 3 years. We approached the first security checkpoint, a wall of reinforced plexiglass and thermal scanners manned by 2 guards who had worked for the Kong family since before I was born. They knew me as the girl who brought them coffee during the late-night shifts and never complained about the cold. As I pressed my palm against the biometric plate, I felt a surge of cold adrenaline. The system chimed, a friendly, high-pitched chirp that signaled my clearance was still active. They hadn't thought to revoke the maid's access because, in their world, I didn't exist enough to be a threat. "Early shift, Damara?" one of the guards asked, his voice echoing through the sterile corridor. He didn't even look up from his monitor. I smiled, a small, practiced expression of tired compliance. "Mr. Minjun wanted the terminal room pristine before the board arrives," I replied, my voice steady despite the hammer-strike rhythm of my heart. "You know how he is about the dust on the servers." The guard chuckled, a dry, dismissive sound, and waved me through. I stepped aside, holding the heavy steel door open just wide enough for Jae-hyun to slip through the blind spot of the overhead camera, a shadow following a ghost. We moved deeper into the labyrinth, passing the rows of safety deposit boxes that held the secrets of 100 dynasties, until we reached the reinforced glass of the primary terminal. Inside, the atmosphere was a sharp contrast to the silence of the vault. The room was bathed in the flickering blue light of a dozen monitors, the air humming with the frantic energy of a digital heist. Minjun was hunched over the main console, his face pale and slick with sweat, his fingers flying across the keys with a desperate, clumsy speed. Standing behind him, her hand resting on his shoulder in a gesture that looked more like a leash than a comfort, was Elena. She was still wearing the red dress from the gallery, though it was now covered by a dark silk wrap. She looked regal, composed, and utterly lethal, her eyes fixed on the progress bar that was slowly draining the lifeblood of the Kong Empire into her private trust. They were so consumed by their victory that they didn't hear the soft click of the door as I engaged the manual lock from the inside, a feature meant to protect the auditors from outside intrusion. "The final authorization is pending, Elena," Minjun panted, his voice cracking with the strain of his betrayal. "Once I turn this key, Jae-hyun's holdings are liquidated. But the security protocols are flagging the transfer. It's asking for a secondary biometric confirmation from a ranking officer." Elena leaned in, her voice a poisonous honey that filled the small room. "Then give it to them, Minjun. You are the ranking officer now. Your brother is a memory in a shattered penthouse. The empire is yours, as long as you have the courage to take it." She was pulling the strings with a master's touch, feeding his ego while she prepared to cut his throat. I looked at Jae-hyun, and I saw the moment his restraint broke. He stepped out of the shadows, the blue light of the monitors catching the hard, obsidian gleam of his eyes. "The problem with ghosts, Minjun," Jae-hyun said, his voice cutting through the hum of the servers like a guillotine blade, "is that they tend to haunt the people who buried them too early." The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum of sound that seemed to suck the air out of the room. Minjun froze, his hand trembling on the physical override key, his eyes bulging as he stared at the reflection of his brother in the monitor. Elena didn't flinch. She turned slowly, her expression shifting from triumphant malice to a cold, calculating mask of appraisal. She didn't look at the gun in Jae-hyun's hand. She looked at me. She saw the gray blazer, the folder in my hand, and the realization of my role in this audit finally dawned on her. "The maid," she spat, the word dripping with a vitriol that made the air sting. "I should have had you disposed of the moment you stepped into the study. You were always too quiet, always watching, a parasite in the corners of the room." I stepped forward, standing level with Jae-hyun, no longer the girl who looked at the floor. "I wasn't a parasite, Elena," I said, my voice cold and resonant. "I was the auditor you never saw coming. You were so busy looking for the king's crown that you forgot who cleans the throne. I didn't just notice the dots on the paper. I noticed the way you looked at the bank codes when you thought no one was watching. I've been tracking your transfers for months." Minjun began to babble, a frantic, incoherent stream of excuses and pleas for mercy, but Jae-hyun ignored him. His focus was entirely on the woman in the red dress. "The transfer is locked, Elena," Jae-hyun said, stepping toward the console. Amara used her clearance to engage the black box protocol the moment we entered the vault. "The system isn't draining my accounts. It's looping the data back into a secure server held by the federal authorities. Every keystroke Minjun made in the last 10 minutes is now evidence in a racketeering case that will bury you both." The color drained from Elena's face, the composure finally shattering to reveal the panicked predator beneath. She reached for a small, silver pistol hidden in the folds of her wrap, but Jae-hyun was faster. He didn't fire. He simply closed the distance in 2 predatory strides and wrenched the weapon from her hand, his grip a reminder of the strength that had flipped the mahogany table. "You thought you were the architect," Jae-hyun hissed, his face inches from hers. "But you were just another stain that needed to be scrubbed away. You used my brother's weakness, you used my trust, and you used the silence of this house to build your pyre. But you forgot one thing." He gestured toward me, a movement of profound, silent respect. "The people you ignore are the ones who hold the keys to every door you want to open. Amara didn't just save my life. She saved the empire you tried to steal. And now, she's the one who's going to lock the door." I walked to the main terminal, my fingers steady as I entered the final override sequence I had practiced 1,000 times in the basement of the penthouse. The screens turned a deep, funereal red as the system initiated a total lockdown of the bank's lower levels. The heavy magnetic bolts of the vault door slammed home with a sound like thunder, sealing us inside the high-tech tomb. The security team above would be alerted, but by the time they cut through the reinforced steel, the digital trail would be indelible, and the authorities would be waiting. Minjun collapsed into the swiveling leather chair, burying his face in his hands, the weight of his failure finally crushing the last of his arrogance. Elena stood rigid, her eyes burning with a hatred so pure it seemed to vibrate, but she was trapped, her red dress a garish, blood-colored cage in the sterile blue light. The audit was over, and the ledger was closed. The king was back on his feet, and the maid was the one holding the pen. Jae-hyun turned to me, the intensity of the moment finally beginning to ebb, replaced by a deep, weary gratitude. He looked at the folder in my hand, then at the monitors where the evidence of the betrayal was still scrolling. "You did it, Amara," he said softly. "You bypassed the security, you trapped the wolves, and you stayed in the light when everyone else was hiding in the dark." I looked at him, feeling the exhaustion of the last 12 hours finally catching up to me. The gray blazer felt heavy, and the air in the vault was growing stale, but for the first time in 3 years, I felt like I could breathe. I wasn't a ghost anymore, and I wasn't an appliance. I was the witness who had survived the shatter. "What happens now?" I asked, looking at the 2 broken figures across the room. Jae-hyun reached out and took my hand, his palm warm and solid, a stark contrast to the cold steel of the vault. "Now, we wait for the light," he said. "The police are on their way, and the board will be informed by noon. The Kong name will survive, but the house needs a complete renovation." He looked around the terminal room, his eyes lingering on the red dress and the trembling brother. "And I think I've found the only person I trust to oversee the new architecture." I looked at him, and I saw a future that didn't involve polishing silver or hiding in the vents. It was a future built on the truth of the gray, a world where the invisible were finally seen. As the distant sirens began to wail through the reinforced walls of the bank, signaling the arrival of the reckoning, I felt a strange sense of peace. The ledger was balanced, the debt was paid, and the woman in the red dress was no longer pulling the strings. We stood together in the heart of the fortress, the fallen king and the girl who knew the dirt, watching as the blue light of the monitors began to fade into the gray of the coming day. The empire was safe, but more importantly, we were still breathing. The final audit was complete, and as the doors were finally breached by the authorities, I knew that the silence of the basement was gone forever. I walked out of the vault beside Jae-hyun, my head held high, leaving the shards of the old world behind in the dark. The morning was finally here, and for the first time, it didn't belong to the kings. It belonged to the people who had survived the shatter. I took one last look at the red dress as the officers led Elena away, a splash of color disappearing into the gray, and then I stepped out into the light, ready to build something that would never break again. The war was over, the audit was closed, and the invisible maid had finally found her voice in the heart of the storm. I felt the cool morning air on my face as we emerged from the bank, the city streets filled with the blue and red flashes of the police escort. Jae-hyun didn't let go of my hand, his grip a silent promise that the new order was real. We walked past the reporters and the curious onlookers, two ghosts who had stepped into the sun. The ledger was tucked safely in my pocket, a testament to the night the glass broke and the truth came out. I looked up at the silver towers of the loop, no longer feeling like a small creature scurrying at their feet, but like someone who understood the bones of the city itself. The king had his kingdom back, but the girl who knew the dirt was the one who held the map. We moved toward the waiting car, the shadows of the night finally retreating, leaving us with the vast, open potential of the day. The shatter was behind us, the audit was done, and as the car pulled away from the curb, I knew that the story of the Kong Empire had just begun its most important chapter. I leaned back into the leather seat, closing my eyes, and listened to the rhythmic hum of the city, a song of survival that I finally knew how to sing. The gray was gone, replaced by the brilliant, unforgiving light of the truth, and I wouldn't have it any other way. The maid had become the architect, and the king had found his soul in the silence of a vault. We were alive, we were seen, and the morning was ours to keep. The morning light did not merely enter the penthouse, it invaded it, slicing across the polished obsidian floors with the surgical, cold precision of a freshly sharpened blade. For years, I had watched this same sun rise as a phantom, a silent, utilitarian fixture in the deep periphery of powerful, arrogant men. I had spent a lifetime blending into the heavy velvet drapes and the charcoal shadows of the doorframes, a creature of habit and invisibility. Today, however, the heavy, scratchy wool of my service uniform was gone, discarded like a skin that no longer fit the predator emerging from within. In its place was a silk slip dress the color of bruised plums and midnight, fluid and ice-cold against my skin. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass, my forehead resting against the cool, vibration-less pain, looking down at the sprawling labyrinth of the city as if it were a complex circuit board I finally possessed the schematics to program. Behind me, the air in the room was thick with the scent of ozone and expensive, clinical cleaning products, the sharp, antiseptic smell of a fresh start that had been bought with a significant, quiet amount of blood and betrayal. Jae-hyun was not a man of half measures or hesitant glances, and the new order he had promised was being carved out of the city's bedrock with a terrifying, rhythmic efficiency. From the hallway, I could hear the heavy, muffled thud of furniture being moved, the sharp, monosyllabic commands of men who didn't need to raise their voices to be feared. The old guard, the sycophants, the leeches, and the double agents who had thrived under the bloated corruption of the previous regime, were being excised like malignant tumors. It was a domestic purge disguised as a corporate restructuring, and Jae-hyun was the primary surgeon, his hands steady and his heart unburdened by the weight of mercy. I didn't need to see the digital ledgers to know that names were being crossed off in red, bank accounts were being frozen with a keystroke, and entire lives were being quietly, permanently dismantled in the shadows of the morning. I simply felt the shift in the building's gravity. The frantic tension that usually vibrated through these reinforced walls had smoothed out into a chilling, crystalline stillness that commanded respect. The heavy mahogany door to the master suite clicked open with a sound like a pistol cocking. Jae-hyun entered not with the exhaustion of a man who had spent the twilight hours dismantling a financial empire, but with the revitalized, hungry hum of a predator who had finally cleared his territory of rivals. He shed his charcoal suit jacket, tossing it onto the Italian leather chaise without a backward glance. His white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, the fabric strained against his shoulders, and his sleeves were rolled up to reveal forearms still tight with the lingering adrenaline of the hunt. He didn't approach me immediately. Instead, he poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a heavy crystal glass, the ice clinking with a sharp, musical sound like breaking teeth. He watched my back for a long, contemplative moment, acknowledging the radical transformation of my silhouette against the rising skyline. I wasn't his shadow anymore. I was the dark axis upon which his entire world now turned. "It's done," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that carried easily across the vast expanse of the room. The board members who hesitated have been retired, with generous, albeit mandatory, severance packages that ensure their silence. The security teams have been replaced with men who owe their lives and their loyalty to me, not the company. There isn't a single person in this building now who doesn't understand exactly who holds the leash and exactly how short that leash has become. I didn't turn around to face him. I watched a lone hawk circle one of the lower skyscrapers, its wings catching the harsh gold of the sun as it hunted for something smaller and weaker. "And the ones who didn't take the severance?" I asked, my voice steady and resonant, devoid of the practiced, hollow subservience that had once been my only armor. "The ones like Minho? The ones who thought they were untouchable because they knew where the bodies were buried and who had held the shovel." Jae-hyun moved then, his footsteps silent on the hand-woven rug until he was standing directly behind me, his presence a wall of heat against my back. He didn't touch me, but I could feel the radiation of his energy, a stark, primal contrast to the chilled glass in front of me. "Minho found out too late that when you bury bodies, you should make sure you aren't standing in the hole when the dirt starts falling," he murmured. "He won't be a problem. No one will be a problem ever again. The house is clean, Amara. For the first time in 30 long years, this empire belongs to a living person, not a ghost haunting a boardroom." I finally turned, my movements slow, deliberate, and laden with a newfound grace. The lack of a restrictive uniform made me feel dangerously exposed and incredibly powerful all at once, as if I had stepped out of a cage I hadn't realized was locked. I looked at his face, the sharp, predatory line of his jaw, the dark, swirling intensity in his eyes that usually sent men stumbling backward in fear, and I saw the perfect reflection of my own cold ambition. We were two sides of a singular coin that had finally landed on its edge. He reached out, his thumb tracing the delicate line of my collarbone, a gesture that was possessive yet oddly reverent. He was the king of this glass and steel mountain, but he knew with a piercing clarity that he had only managed to climb it because I had pointed out the hidden handholds in the dark. "You look different without the starch and the polyester," he remarked, his eyes roaming over the shimmering silk of my dress. "Less like a weapon kept hidden in a velvet drawer, and more like the one held directly at a throat." "The uniform was a disguise, a camouflage for the soul," I replied, my hand rising to cover his, my slender fingers interlacing with his own calloused ones. "It allowed me to see everything because no one bothers to look at the help. They talk over you as if you are a piece of furniture. But you can't rule from the long shadows forever, Jae-hyun. Eventually, the sun comes up, and you have to decide if you're going to let it burn you, or if you're going to become the light itself." He let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh, leaning his forehead against mine until our breaths mingled in the quiet air. "I think we've already decided on the light. The city thinks they're getting a new CEO, a fresh face for the evening news. They have no idea they're actually getting a new god. And they certainly don't know who is whispering the commandments into my ear while they sleep." We stood there for a long time, overlooking the sprawling, chaotic metropolis that was now our personal playground. The new order wasn't just about the men Jae-hyun had removed or the archaic systems he had overhauled with such violence. It was about my own metamorphosis from an observer to a master architect. I thought back to the countless nights I had spent polishing these same obsidian floors, listening to the whispered secrets of men who thought I was part of the architecture. Those secrets were now my primary currency, and I intended to spend them with a ruthless wisdom. The house was clean, yes, but I knew that dust always returned to the cracks. The difference was that now I held the master key to every locked room, and I knew exactly where the new bodies would be hidden if anyone dared to smudge the glass I had worked so hard to clear. The phone on the heavy marble desk vibrated, a low, insistent hum that broke the heavy intimacy of the moment. Jae-hyun didn't move to answer it. He didn't even glance toward the sound. He simply tightened his grip on my hand, a silent, powerful acknowledgement that the rest of the world would have to wait until we were ready to address it. The power had shifted irrevocably. The ghosts were gone, exorcised by their own ambition. And in the dead center of the new order, I stood tall, no longer a servant to the throne, but the very heart and soul of it. The silk of my dress shimmered like oil on water as I finally moved toward the desk, my stride long and confident, every inch the queen of the beautiful ruins we had built together. I picked up the phone, my voice cool, commanding, and utterly lethal as I spoke the first words of our new reign, a sound that echoed through the penthouse like a heavy bell tolling for the end of the old world. The transition was seamless, a masterclass in calculated, cold evolution. As the hours ticked by, the penthouse transformed from a silent sanctuary into a high-functioning war room. Reports began to flood in via secure lines, logistics of the new, elite security detail, legal filings that shifted ownership of a dozen shell companies, and the panicked, sycophantic messages of those still trying to find a footing in the shifting sand of the new regime. I handled them all with a terrifying, effortless grace. I didn't need to consult Jae-hyun on the minutiae. I knew the labyrinth of his mind, as well as I knew my own. I redirected assets, cut off communication lines for the disloyal, and established the new hierarchy with the flick of a digital pen. Jae-hyun watched me from the shadows of the lounge, a strange, unreadable expression of pride and subtle wariness on his face. He had unleashed something he couldn't fully control, and for a man of his temperament, that should have been deeply unsettling. Instead, it seemed to intoxicate him like a potent wine. He saw me not as a subordinate, but as his true equal, a partner in a crime so large and all-encompassing that the world would eventually call it legal. The penthouse, once a lonely cage of glass and ego, now felt like the bridge of a great, unstoppable ship, cutting through the thick fog of the city's corruption toward a horizon only the two of us could see. By the time the evening began to settle over the mountains, the transformation was complete. The cleaning of the house was no longer a metaphor, it was a reality. The air was crisp, the remaining staff was silent and efficient, and the power dynamic was solidified in steel. I returned to the window, the city lights beginning to flicker on like 1,000 grounded stars. I felt a profound, heavy sense of arrival. The girl who had scrubbed floors and swallowed insults was gone, buried forever under the weight of the silk and the gravity of her own choices. I was the power behind the throne, the silent architect of a new era, and as I looked out at the world I had helped conquer, I knew that the new order was only just beginning its ascent. The city glowed beneath me, a vast expanse of ambition and greed that I now held firmly in the palm of my hand. I thought of the others, the ones who had underestimated me, the ones who had looked through me as if I were made of thin air. They were the ones currently scrambling in the dark, trying to figure out how the locks had changed and why the doors were no longer opening for them. Jae-hyun came up behind me again, his hands resting heavily on my shoulders, a grounding weight in the swirl of my thoughts. "What are you thinking about?" he whispered into the curve of my neck, his breath warm against my skin. "I'm thinking about how quiet it finally is," I said, my voice a soft, dangerous melody that matched the rhythm of the city below. I spent so long listening to the deafening noise of other people's power. It's strange and quite beautiful to finally hear the sound of my own. He turned me around to face him, his eyes searching mine for any flicker of lingering regret or hesitation. He found none. He saw only the cold, brilliant light of a woman who had finally found her place in the world and had no intention of ever letting it go. He leaned in, his lips brushing mine in a silent seal of our new, dark alliance. The new order was established, the house was clean, and for the first time in my life, I was exactly where I was meant to be. The sun had set on the ghosts of the past, and in the rising darkness, we were the only ones who knew how to see. Every shadow in the room belonged to us now, and every light in the valley below was a tribute to the silent power I had finally claimed as my own. The world was small, and we were very, very large.